у нас сьогодні презентація англійською мовою, тому я переключусь на англійську. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Bank of Ukraine. I'm a Deputy Governor Dmytro Sologub. It's my great pleasure today to announce our open research seminar. As you know, that's a regular event we have, but I think it's pretty particular event today because we have a very prominent speaker. Probably difficult to, for person who ever studied monetary policy and macroeconomics, didn't hear or didn't come across the name of Professor Lоуренс Болл from John Hopkins University, who is one of the most renowned scholars in this field. So it's a great pleasure to have Mr. Bolл here in the National Bank. We are extremely pleased and extremely happy with that. Mr. Bolл came already, I think, on Monday, and we had a very good discussion yesterday. So also, as I have heard, very good event yesterday is Kyiv School of Economics, which drew a lot of attention, and also Mr. Bolл will be one of the speakers of our conference, National Bank Annual Research Conference, which starts tomorrow afternoon. So today, Mr. Bolл is presenting his paper on inflation in India. I mean, probably somebody would say there is nothing to do with Ukraine, but it's actually not true because I think, all emerging markets, they're similar in some way. And I think for us, for my colleagues in the bank, but also from our participants outside the NBU, I think it would be very interesting to see this analysis and the conclusions, and we definitely here in the central bank with our now policy of inflation targeting is very much interested in the research on other emerging markets, because as we discussed during our meeting yesterday, the fundamental research and thorough policy analysis should be behind policy decisions made by the central bank. It's pretty clear to me, to my colleagues in the board, and we are relentlessly working in this direction. Therefore, I would just like to give a floor to Professor Bolл and thank once again for this wonderful opportunity for us to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed being here. I learned a lot about research projects going on here this morning, so I'll try to return the favor by talking about my research. So this is based on a paper which I did with a couple of Indian co-authors in 2015 for a conference in India, and it's fairly obvious why a conference in India might be interested in inflation in India. As the Deputy Governor alluded to, somebody might ask, why is this relevant for Ukraine? And I think, how far is Ukraine from India? I don't know, fairly far, and there are, different cultural differences, probably different economic differences. But again, it's my hypothesis that emerging economies have a lot in common, including the inflation process, although that's a hypothesis. So actually, I would like to have a discussion back and forth about in what ways is India a good example for Ukraine, and in what way are there special factors? Actually, we were discussing at lunch that every country thinks that it's special. Just I think I'm special. Each of us thinks we're special. Every country. So I know in India, as I'll discuss, I think a lot of my ideas about Indian inflation are based on historical experiences in the United States. And some people in India said, oh, that fits the United States, but you don't know anything about India. India is different and special. But I think I persuaded myself that there are a lot of similarities between India and the U.S. in some eras. And again, I suspect, my hypothesis is that there are also some similarities in Ukraine, but I'll be interested in getting your feedback. Okay, so again, this paper was done about a year and a half ago, and so some of the basic facts in India are actually similar to Ukraine. So I guess what the inflation rate is now, 12% or 12.2. Okay, so okay, well, so India got up to 12.1, so it is actually more similar than I thought. Now, of course, unlike Ukraine, which actually had a period of 40% annual inflation. India had, for a long time, had quite low inflation, under 5%. And then in the early 2000s, it started creeping up and got up to 12%. And then it became a very big issue in the media and in politics, that inflation was over 10%, and that was a big national problem. Actually, in the last several years, inflation has fallen. So it was down to about 5% in 2015 and is slightly below that now. There's now a debate about, was it a one-time episode of inflation going up in India and now we're back to low single digits, or is there a danger of inflation coming back again in India? And more generally, the experience with inflation has prompted a lot of debate about what factors cause inflation in India. And again, I don't think too many of you were at the talk yesterday, but we had a discussion about monetary versus non-monetary theories of inflation. So if you read what the media in India said about inflation, or what politicians say, they have lots of different theories about what causes inflation. So a lot of explanations focus on rapidly rising food prices. So part of the inflationary phenomenon was rapidly rising food prices. And there were a lot of different explanations for why food prices were rising, partly changing dietary patterns, which cause an increase in demand for certain kinds of, for meat and certain other kinds of food items, partly poor harvests that reduced the supply of some kinds of food. A number of government policies, the government raised the minimum wage. People said that that was inflationary. There was expansionary fiscal policy. Some people blamed inflation on that. And given these different theories about food prices and government policies and fiscal policy, there was a debate about, is there really anything the central bank can do to control inflation? So if the underlying cause of inflation is that people are changing their dietary patterns, or harvests have not been good, the central bank does not have the policy tools to determine people's diet or to make harvests better, and the central bank doesn't control fiscal policy. So a big debate in India has been to what degree is inflation something under the control of the central bank? So can the central bank control inflation, and should the central bank try to control inflation? Will there be adverse side effects on the economy if the central bank tries too hard to control inflation? And this, I'm sure, is relevant for Ukraine today. There's a lot of discussion about inflation expectations. If we have an episode where inflation rises, is that going to be transitory, or will a period of high inflation eventually lead people to expect higher inflation, so that we get, so inflation becomes inertial? We have a self-fulfilling spiral in which expected inflation is high, and that keeps actual inflation high, and that keeps expected inflation high. So that's just a brief flavor of debates in recent years in India about inflation. Now again, I'm not sure how similar that is to debates in Ukraine, but when I learned about this debate in India, about inflation since 2000, it actually made me rather nostalgic as an American. So a dirty secret about myself is that I started graduate school in 1980, a few years ago. But so 1980 was the very end of the 1970s. So a big focus of what I studied in graduate school was the terrible problem of inflation in the 1970s. And actually, inflation was reduced in 1982-83 when I was halfway through graduate school. But I remember the days when President Gerald Ford said inflation is public enemy #1 in the United States. And actually, this is a somewhat irrelevant anecdote, but probably nobody here has heard of win buttons, W-I-N. So President Gerald Ford, who was president briefly in the mid-1970s after President Nixon resigned, inflation was very high. He made a speech. He said it's the #1 enemy of our country is inflation, and we're going to defeat inflation through good economic policies. But he also wanted to rally public support for defeating inflation. And so the government distributed big buttons you could wear on your lapel, and it said W-I-N, which of course is the word win in English, but it also was an acronym. It stood for whip inflation now. So somehow, and actually, I don't think it actually really worked very well, and it wasn't clear what the mechanism was linking wearing these buttons to, but that reflected the sense that it was this national problem, and the government wasn't quite sure what to do about it, but we needed some kind of national effort to defeat inflation. And again, there was a lot of debate then in the U.S. in the 1970s about can the central bank control inflation? So again, one factor causing spikes in inflation in the U.S. in the 1970s was the big increases in oil prices determined by the OPEC cartel. So oil prices tripled at 2 different points in the 1970s, and that caused spurts in inflation. And so some economists and politicians said, well, unless Federal Reserve officials can go to Saudi Arabia and tell OPEC what to do, there's no way to control inflation. Similarly, there was talk about unions being aggressive, demanding higher wages, which was passed through into prices. And some people said, well, there's nothing, again, unless Federal Reserve officials can convince union leaders to take smaller wage increases, there's no way to influence inflation. Another school of thought was that it is possible to control inflation if the Fed raises interest rates to very high levels, but that it will be extremely costly, or too costly to do that. Even reducing inflation a little bit would require a massive recession and a massive increase in unemployment, so that the costs are so large that politically nobody would ever let the Federal Reserve cause the massive recession necessary to reduce inflation. All right, now I think in the end of the story about the U.S. is that in the early 1980s, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker took decisive actions to reduce inflation, and I think proved to the satisfaction of Americans that central banks can control inflation, or at least can reduce inflation when they want to, by raising interest rates. And I think that episode also showed clearly that there are costs to reducing inflation, that there was a deep recession in the early 1980s in the U.S., but that it was not, but it was a substantial cost, but not such a horrible cost that it prevented disinflation from happening. In addition to this policy discussion, the U.S. experience spawned a lot of research on what determines inflation. I'd say here there's been less research on India, probably also somewhat less research on Ukraine. What we're going to find, now again, the United States and most advanced economies are now in a very different situation. Inflation is very low in most advanced economies, and actually now there's the problem which nobody imagined possible in the 1970s or 80s, which is that people think inflation is too low, and there's a question of whether the central bank can raise inflation to a higher level and what to do if interest rates hit zero. So that's quite different from the situation today in India or in Ukraine. So But again, India and possibly Ukraine make me nostalgic because it reminds me not of the U.S. today, but of the U.S. in the 1970s. Also a situation, I should say, in which inflation was quite volatile, and it appeared that inflation expectations were not well anchored, and that when inflation went up or down, that led to changes in inflation expectations, and that made changes in inflation persistent. That's an idea. Again, in advanced economies, it now appears that inflation expectations are quite well anchored, that the Federal Reserve has strong credibility for the idea that they're going to try to produce 2% inflation, and expectations are anchored at that level. But that was not the case in the U.S. in the 1970s, and not the case in India, and maybe, and actually I'm happy to get feedback at any point. I don't know what the view is on how volatile or anchored inflation expectations are in Ukraine right now.
I showed yesterday the plots. Yeah, it seems that still, so inflation expectations of the professional forecasters, yeah, of the banks employees, they are quite close currently to the National Bank of Ukraine forecast. But at the same time, if you look at the inflation expectations of the population, of the representatives of business, so they're still quite high, about 15%, yeah, and they're actually decreasing, because I remember they were higher than 20% at the moment, 2 years ago, yeah, but still they are quite high, yeah, and it seems that that is not only the Ukrainian specific. Yeah, in many countries actually the inflation expectations of the population is much higher. And recently I read one interesting paper about the perception of inflation by population, and it seems that population, when estimates the inflation dynamics, usually they take into account not the whole consumer basket, but only the goods which are consumed on daily, on weekly basis, so the prices which they observe very fast. And of course, due to the volatility of these prices, usually in mentality it creates impression that inflation is much higher. And that's why, it seems that that's why the people expect much higher inflation compared with the professional forecasters.
Okay, interesting. Okay, maybe I'll, with that motivation, talk about what this paper does. And actually there are two main parts of the paper. So one is about the issue of measuring core inflation, because actually headline inflation in India is extremely volatile, probably more volatile, I'm not sure, we can look at the data, probably more volatile, the quarterly frequency, than it is here. And it was very hard for us to find any way to explain quarterly movements in headline inflation. They just looked like they had a large component that was just noise. But we had more success in explaining core inflation. But of course, before we do that, we have to define what core inflation is. So I'm a big believer in using as a measure of core inflation the weighted median of industry price changes, which is something which is done, not the primary measure here, but which is calculated. In any case, in the United States, the most common measure of core inflation is inflation excluding food and energy. I think even for the United States, briefly, when people measure core inflation, they take food and energy out of the inflation index because food and energy prices are volatile, and you often have large changes in the relative prices of food and energy. But food and energy are not the only prices that are volatile. If you look at headline inflation in the U.S., sometimes other sectors have big price changes, and that also causes transitory movements in in headline inflation. So I'll go into a little more detail about how we measure core inflation, but the basic idea is a core inflation measure should take out shocks to industries that cause unusually large relative price changes. And it should take those out if the industries are food and energy, but it should also take out large changes from any industry. And looking at a median is a one way of eliminating the influence of large outliers. I guess there's also, here you compute trimmed means as well as the median. I'm not sure. I think it's an open research question whether the median is the best measure of core inflation, or whether it should be a trimmed mean, or if it's a trimmed mean, how big the tails are that you should take off. Some kind of measure that either trims the mean or trims the mean all the way down to the median is a straightforward way to take out big price changes. Anyway, so I will talk about our measurement of core inflation in India. And then with the measurement of core inflation, we then try to see, is there any way to explain its behavior? And we are fairly successful in explaining a good part of core inflation behavior with a textbook Phillips curve, or the kind of Phillips curve which again does not fit the US today, where inflation expectations are anchored, but fit the US, say, in the 1970s, when expected inflation appeared quite backward-looking. So again, I'll write down an equation or two in a minute, but the basic idea behind our Phillips curve is that inflation depends partly on expected inflation, and expected inflation is just an average of past inflation. That also the output gap, or the level of slack in the economy, also pushes inflation up or down. And again, we can discuss. I tend to believe that the Phillips curve is a pretty universal fact of economies, and that in any economy I know, if a large negative output gap opens up, that will tend to reduce inflation, and if output goes way above potential, that'll tend to raise inflation. Again, I think there was debate in India about whether there was or was not a Phillips curve trade-off. And I think part of the reason it was unclear was, again, people were looking at headline inflation, and headline inflation is so noisy in India that it's hard to explain it with anything, including output gaps. But once you focus in on core inflation, which is somewhat less volatile, then it's possible to detect a Phillips curve relationship where the output gap matters. Any questions or comments or general discussion before I go into more of the details? Again, I'm happy to talk. Okay. All right. So now, again, I think the National Bank of Ukraine, I know, works with the concept of core inflation, so I think this will be familiar. Our framework is one in which headline inflation is the sum of core inflation and what are often called supply shocks. But I think the right way to interpret, so again, going back in the literature on US inflation, starting in the 1970s, it was clear that there was something called a supply shock, that when oil prices changed dramatically, that caused movements in inflation. But it wasn't, for a long time, there was a debate about how exactly do we define or measure supply shocks. I have a paper actually with a well-known Ukrainian-American economist, Greg Mankiw. Is his background well-known? Greg Mankiw, all four of his grandparents were born in Ukraine. What's that? Yeah. And actually, the name Mankiw in English is some kind of translation from, yeah, But yeah, okay. But Greg told me his textbook was translated into Ukrainian, and so they took the English, the name Mankiw in English and translated it back into Ukrainian, and I guess it ended up quite different from the original. They translated it one way and back changed it quite a bit, but anyway, it's neither. So anyway, I think Ukraine can be proud of Greg. So he and I did a paper quite some time ago where we said that the way we define supply shocks is large changes in relative prices caused by some kind of microeconomic shock. So if OPEC makes an agreement to raise oil prices, that raises the relative price of oil, or if there's a drought and a bad harvest, that raises the relative price of food. Those are supply shocks. And if you think about, and again, I think these ideas are probably familiar to many of you because you've looked at trimmed means. If you look at the distribution of price changes across industries, the way to think about supply shocks are cases in which there's a large tail on the right side or the left side of the distribution of price changes. I'll give you some examples for India for a while. But if you look, say, in the 1970s in the US, in years in which the inflation rate jumped up, if you do the distribution of price changes across industries, the distribution is quite skewed to the right because a number of sectors related to energy had very large price increases, 20%, 30%, 40%, and there were not any sectors that had 20 or 30 or 40% decreases, so you got this big right tail. So, so in our work, we talk about supply shocks consist of unusually large changes in certain relative prices, and the way to detect supply shocks is to look at the distribution of price changes across industries, and if it's very skewed to the right or to the left, that's a supply shock. Now, Brian and Cicchetti are, I think, pioneers in measuring core inflation, but I think their ideas are related to the ideas that Greg and I worked on. So if you think that supply shocks mean that you have a large right tail or a large left tail in the distribution of price changes, the way to get rid of supply shocks and isolate core inflation is to chop off the tails of the distribution and just look at a trimmed mean or look at the median. Actually, wherever I go in the world, I try to advertise the idea of measuring core inflation with trimmed means or medians, because I think it makes a lot of sense theoretically. I mean, from a theoretical point of view, saying we're going to measure core inflation by taking out certain industries is somewhat arbitrary. And again, it makes more sense to take out large relative price changes in whatever industry they come from. Also, I think empirically, I've worked on this a lot for the US, and I think empirically, if inflation is measured as, if core inflation is measured as inflation less food and energy in the US, that variable is less volatile than headline inflation, but still quite volatile at the quarterly frequency. Even if you take out food and energy from US inflation, they're quite large quarter-to-quarter movements. And actually, if you look quarter by quarter, you can see different things happen to different industries. I forget which year this was, but there was one year where there was a big increase in tobacco taxes. And so, tobacco taxes went up by 40%, and so cigarette prices jumped, by over, at an annualized rate, I think by more than 100% and cigarettes are not that big a sector of the U.S. economy, but with that one sector having an annualized inflation rate of 100%, that caused a noticeable upward blip in headline inflation. And if you take out food and energy prices, you still have tobacco prices, so that was still there. Actually, again, I'm talking here about the U.S., but I've spent a fair amount of time looking at what industries besides food and energy sometimes are fairly large industries and sometimes experience large relative price changes. And actually, one of the ones that often shows up is women's clothing. So this is just, I don't know that much about the women's clothing industry, but it's women's clothing specifically, not men's clothing. I take it that, and again, this is probably true in other countries as well, that there are often, you know, big price markups and then big sales, and the prices of women, you know, so if a lot of clothes are marked up or down by 50%, again, if that happens in a quarter, then if you annualize it, it's a 200% inflation rate, and clothing is a big enough part of the economy that can have a non-negligible effect on headline inflation. Yes?
I can provide you the example of the similar situation in Ukraine, even more funny, yeah, because, you know, in 2015, so in the beginning of the year, we had the peak in our inflation. In annual terms, it reached 61% in April. But because of the huge devaluation in the beginning of the year and also because of the administrative hike. But this inflation effect started to fade quite fast, and in summer inflation was more or less moderate. But what happened in September, actually it was surprising for us, but inflation jumped up very significantly, and the core inflation jumped up even more. And the reason for that was the price of the new collection of the clothes and footwear. And the problem was that these new collections reflected the depreciation effect, the effect of the depreciation which happened in the beginning of the year. But because all this winter stuff was from the previous collection, so the prices in spring and in summer were not revised. And you know, usually before this component of CPI was one of the most stable one of the most stable, and our standard measure of core inflation didn't help us to explain, to reflect the fundamental inflation pressure. And we also tried to find some additional measures. We also published first time in our inflation note, which we produce every month, the measure of trimmed mean measure of core inflation, and also this factor pushed us to develop additional alternative methods to calculate core inflation, because sometimes this exclusion-based measure of core inflation also can produce very strange results and which do not reflect the fundamental pressure.
Yeah. So again, I won't belabor this too much, but I think theoretically, a trimmed mean or median is a good measure of core inflation. Empirically, if you look at the data, it's more smooth because you don't get strange episodes like the ones we're talking about. Also, people in the US have done studies about what variable is good for forecasting future headline inflation. And I think a number of people have found the result that a median inflation rate is a better forecaster of future headline inflation than current headline inflation is, or that inflation excluding food and energy is. So if one characteristic of a good core inflation measure is that it helps you predict where inflation is going in the future, again, I think there's evidence that the weighted median does well for that. Okay. So maybe I'll go ahead. All right, so I think we were the first ones for India to compute a weighted median. In the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland has a series of median inflation, which I use a lot of my research, and I take it you have a series on median inflation. I think nobody had computed that before in India, so we did that. We did that for the wholesale price index, not the consumer price index. And the reason for that is simply that in India, the consumer price index is only disaggregated into, I think, 4 different components. So there's not, to have a distribution of price changes and talk about whether it's symmetric or asymmetric and calculate trimmed means or medians, you need fairly disaggregated industry price indices. And again, for India, I think actually just a couple of years ago they started disaggregating the CPI to a higher degree. But going back to 1994, not that far in history, but at least for 20 years, we had fairly disaggregated wholesale price index numbers. So we had either 61 or then 81 industries in the latter part of our sample, and we could look at the distribution of inflation rates in the 61 or 81 industries and calculate a median. Okay, so here are some results, and actually these are results not seasonally adjusted. So we just computed inflation rates from industry price changes. Let me go ahead. We then applied a standard seasonal adjustment, and probably those results are more meaningful. So what you see in this graph, the black line is headline inflation, quarterly headline inflation at annualized rates. And no, I'm sorry, I got it backwards. The dotted line is headline inflation. The solid black line is core inflation. And I think 2 things are evident from this picture. I think one of them we expected, and one of them was a surprise. The thing we expected is that, as in every country I've looked at, median inflation is less volatile than headline inflation. Sort of pointer here. Oops. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so obviously for, headline inflation goes up, way up and way down, bounces around. There's quite a bit less variability in core inflation. And again, in every country I've looked at, you get a more stable inflation rate if you look at the median rather than headline inflation. The thing that surprised us that I've not seen in other countries is that there is also a substantial difference in the average levels of inflation, depending on whether you look at headline inflation or the median. Again, so in the United States, if we had the same picture, we would have median inflation being fairly stable, and then headline inflation fluctuating above and below median inflation, but averaging out to almost exactly the same level. Whereas here, if you stare at this a little bit, it's a lot more common for headline inflation to be above median inflation than for it to be below median inflation. The numbers, if you just average over the sample, the average level of headline inflation is 5.6%, and the average level of median inflation is 3.4%. When we looked at the underlying data, that reflects the fact, so in a given quarter, if there are big relative price increases and the distribution of price changes is skewed to the right, then headline inflation is above median inflation, because median inflation takes out the right tail. If there are large relative price decreases in some industries, the distribution can be skewed to the left, and then headline inflation is below median inflation. Again, I don't have pictures here of US data, but in the US, sometimes the distribution of price changes is skewed to the right, sometimes it's skewed to the left. So sometimes median inflation is above headline, sometimes below. But in India, it's much more common. And I think even though I've emphasized that food and energy are not the only sectors that can have large relative price changes, they do account for a substantial portion of the large relative price changes. And in India, there are quite a few quarters in which certain food prices go up by large amounts, 40 or 50%, and it's quite rare to have any price decreases of similar magnitudes. So, let's see what this is, the next slide. Yes, here are actually some examples of specific quarters in which we look at the distribution of price changes. And so in the upper left, that's an example of a quarter in which the distribution of prices is quite skewed to the right, because there are some industries, and I could look it up, but this must be certain kinds of agricultural products that had 100% inflation rates, so there's a substantial right tail. And when you have that kind of distribution, you get the headline inflation is quite a bit above median. The rest of the figure shows some other quarters, and they are different shapes. Actually, in the lower right-hand panel, that's one case in which the distribution is skewed to the left. I think, if I can go back, that's actually, there was this one quarter in 2009 when median went below headline inflation. I think that's the quarter in the bottom right-hand panel there. But that's uncommon. So more often the median, more often the distribution is skewed to the right, so on average headline inflation is higher than median inflation. Now I don't know, what are the facts about that in this country? Have people noticed systematic differences in the average? Yeah, so I was, yeah. So anyway, we were quite surprised by this, so actually, I think that means actually, in terms of inflation forecasting for India, if you're forecasting future headline inflation, you would not want to use current median inflation, because again, there's difference in averages. Probably you would want to do something like forecasting future headline inflation with current median inflation plus 2 percentage points, given that that's the average difference between the two. Okay. Okay, so I think we've gone through these points already. Median inflation is less volatile. It's the average level is lower, which is surprising. And here, I think this is an interesting detail. What we did was to look at the distributions of price changes in each quarter and look at what industries, so again, if you go back to these pictures, say in the upper left-hand corner, there are certain industries way out in the right-hand tail. we looked at, for all our quarters, at which industries are in the right-hand tail. And this is a list of, roughly speaking, how often, so we look at the top 10% of price changes. So if you're thinking about trimming a mean, you're trimming a distribution, take the top 10% of the distribution. What are the industries that are in there? And they tend to be food and fuel. Not always. There are also non-food commodities, metals, chemicals. But the most common industries that have large relative price increases are food and fuel. So in that sense, when people say that we can explain inflationary episodes in India by food prices, there is some element of truth to that, that in quarters where you see headline inflation spiking up above median inflation, above core inflation, that's often because there are large increases in food prices or in fuel prices. Okay. Small problem with the slides, but we can work through that. How long are we aiming to continue? Okay. All right. Well, then maybe I'll speed up a little bit and finish the most important things to say, and then happy to have discussion. So the first part of our paper is measuring core inflation, and then the second part is modeling inflation. And again, because I probably won't get this into detail, this is a Phillips curve, and we've tried estimating this Phillips curve for India with headline inflation, and everything is insignificant, or the parameter estimates don't make any sense. Again, because headline inflation is just so noisy, we can't find any equation that explains it very well. But with core inflation, we were reasonably successful in using a textbook-style Phillips curve. So this is Milton Friedman's expectations augmented Phillips curve from his famous 1968 address to the American Economic Association, where he says that inflation depends on expected inflation, and then on Milton Friedman says unemployment relative to the natural rate. Actually, the first thing I did, so generally, there's a variable in the Phillips curve measuring economic slack. Milton Friedman measured economic slack with the unemployment rate. So the first thing I did with my research assistant in this project was to say, go get quarterly data on the unemployment rate in India, and my research assistant reported that unemployment data is only collected every 5 years in India. So we decided we would measure slack not with unemployment, but with the output gap. And actually, I'll come back to this. It's not clear that's an ideal measure either, but we took quarterly output and just detrended it with the Hodrick-Prescott filter and called that the output gap. Now, yeah, so I'm sorry for the typos on the slide, but yeah, it says inflation equals expected inflation plus alpha times x minus x star is the output gap, the gap between output and potential output. Okay, now, in order to estimate this, we need to decide how to model the expected inflation term. And again, our hypothesis, which I think ended up fitting India's data pretty well, was that inflation expectations, that there was clear, actually, one way in which India is similar to Ukraine is that they recently announced a switch to inflation targeting. I think this was the end of 2014, in India. They announced they would have a 4% inflation target, which if they'd asked me, I might have suggested a slightly higher level, but they didn't ask. But in any case, they are now transitioning to inflation targeting, and I think have the goal of anchoring inflation expectations at the target. But for the historical period that we are looking at, inflation varied all over the place, and there wasn't any anchor for expectations. And again, this is very reminiscent of the United States in the 1970s, that the best proxy for expectations is probably just an average of inflation rates in the past. Now, I think one thing, again, motivated by the US Phillips curve literature, is that in situations in which inflation is backward-looking, expected inflation does not depend on just the most recent quarter or even the most recent year of inflation, that it's a pretty long moving average of inflation which determines expectations. And that actually implies that expectations change fairly slowly. So even if actual inflation goes up or down for several quarters, that only partially moves expected inflation. Anyway, the way we end up modeling expected inflation, and I think this is a good specification for a lot of economies, because we want to capture the idea that long lags of inflation can matter, but we don't want to have lots of different parameters. We don't want to have 10 inflation lags, each with a separate coefficient that we estimate. That would be impossible. So we have a partial adjustment model in which expected inflation is some weighted average of past expected inflation and past actual inflation. And when you solve that out, it means that expected inflation depends on past inflation rates going back to the beginning of time, but with weights that decline exponentially. And gamma is a parameter that we estimate. It shows how quickly or slowly expected inflation adjusts when actual inflation deviates from expectations. So putting that together, this equation just takes the expectations augmented Phillips curve, and instead of writing expected inflation, we just substitute in this sum of past inflation rates with exponentially declining weights. And so this is a Phillips curve that has two parameters. The parameter gamma, which again determines how quickly expectations adjust to changes in actual inflation, and then the parameter alpha, which is the coefficient on the output gap, or which tells how steep or flat the Phillips curve is. Okay, so I'm getting pretty close to finishing the main points. So we just estimate these two parameters by nonlinear least squares, and here's what we get. So the coefficient on the output gap is about 1. The t-statistic is almost exactly 2, so the statistical significance is borderline here. And again, because the inflation series in India is fairly noisy and we have only 20 years of data, we're not surprised that our estimates are not terribly precise. But with a t-statistic of approximately 2, there does seem to be statistical evidence of significant effect of the output gap on inflation, even though it's not estimated very precisely. I guess a 95% confidence interval will go anywhere from about 0 to about 2. Now, this parameter gamma, again, is how quickly inflation expectations adjust. And a high value of gamma, or a value close to 1, means a lot of persistence in expectations. If you look back at the equation, as gamma gets close to 1, expected inflation moves only very slowly. And we get a gamma of 0.9 means that if inflation goes 1 percentage point above expected inflation for a quarter, that causes only a 1/10 of a percentage point change in expected inflation. Or to put it differently, if you start in a steady state with a certain level of inflation and expected inflation, and actual inflation jumped up to a higher level, the convergent expected inflation would start rising, but I think the convergence process, the half-life would be something, a couple of years or something like that. It takes quite a while for expectations to adjust to changes in actual inflation. One exercise we did, I don't have it on a slide here, but one thing you can do with the Phillips curve is you can calculate the sacrifice ratio, or to say, given the behavior expectations and the coefficient on the output gap, if you want to reduce the inflation rate permanently by 1 percentage point, how much output do you have to give up? And the number we get is 2.7. So you have to give up 2.7% of a year's output in order to reduce the inflation rate by 1 percentage point. Something that's a little bit surprising about that, especially given the imprecision in our estimates, is that's actually similar to sacrifice ratios that other people have estimated for India with very different techniques, and also quite similar to sacrifice ratios in lots of different economies. So I've estimated sacrifice ratios for the US, and they tend to come out on the order of magnitude of 2 or 3. And I think also for many, I think this is probably not quite a universal constant, but it seems that for a lot of economies, the output inflation trade-off involves giving up about 2 or 3% of a year's output to reduce the inflation rate by 1 percentage point. So that's a number to keep in mind in thinking about how rapidly to try to reduce the level of inflation. Okay, I think actually that may be just about, the last thing we do, which I'll just describe this verbally, is, I'll refer back to the Phillips curve. So in this equation, the inflation rate is the core inflation rate. So we're explaining the current core inflation rate with a long average of past core inflation rates. Again, in my happy memories of being a young student in the early 1980s studying the 1970s, a big debate was whether movements in headline inflation do or do not feed into future core inflation. So there was a debate. So even if you have core inflation on the left-hand side of the Phillips curve, and you're trying to explain core inflation, is that explained by past core inflation, or is that explained by past headline inflation? Because the story that a lot of people gave about the U.S. in the 1970s is that when oil prices jumped up, initially that was a supply shock, not an increase in core inflation. But the fact that headline inflation jumped up caused inflation expectations to jump up, and then higher inflation expectations fed into future core inflation. Actually, if you look at the U.S. data, a number of studies have established this. There's a very sharp regime shift around the early 1980s disinflation. That in the 1970s, before the big disinflation, the correct variable for the right-hand side of the Phillips curve was headline inflation, and that supply shocks that raised headline inflation fed into core inflation in the future. Since the Volcker disinflation, and apparently the Fed establishing a commitment to containing inflation, the results are quite different. movements in headline inflation that are caused by supply shocks did not seem to feed into core inflation. What we found for India, again, the results are a little bit imprecise, but it looks more like, again, India's Phillips curve looks more like the U.S. Phillips curve of the 1970s than the current U.S. Phillips curve, that it seems that supply shocks, that core inflation depends on past levels of headline inflation, so that even if an increase in inflation is initially a supply shock, it feeds into core inflation, in less monetary policy sufficiently contractionary to offset the effects. And again, presumably, part of the goal of inflation targeting in India is to anchor inflation expectations so that temporary shocks to inflation no longer feed into inflation expectations. And in a few years, we'll have data on how successful that's been in India. But to summarize very briefly, I think we find evidence that it's a lot easier to understand inflation in India if you look at weighted median inflation rather than the very noisy headline series. And once you look at weighted median inflation, that sort of the traditional Phillips curve that fit the U.S. in the 1970s fits recent Indian history fairly well. And again, I'll be interested to hear whether people hypothesize that does or does not carry over to Ukraine. But I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation, and of course it is inspiring us to do something similar analysis. And we also assessed the sacrifice ratio for the Ukrainian economy, taking into account, based on our QPN models, which was presented to you today. Yeah, and it seems that for us this sacrifice ratio is much lower, actually much lower, about by 10 times, something like 0.3 of annual GDP. Maybe that's the reason. The reason for that is that our inflation is much more volatile, and it's much easier to decrease it by 1 percentage point. But maybe we should recalculate it using using the data, and maybe the results will be different. But in order to implement this methodology, you describe it here, so assessment of the Phillips curve, I have some concerns that it will be impossible. No, I mean it will create some biased results, because we already discussed it during the lunch. Yes, that Ukraine is different in India, at least in one very important aspect. Yeah, so the Ukraine is very open economy, and exchange rate plays very important role. And without taking into account the exchange rate in this Phillips curve equation, so we will get very different, very strange sign, for example, for the parameter on the output gap, because usually, for example, when we have the crisis, exchange rate depreciates, inflation rises, but at the same time we have a negative output gap. And what is your, so in that case, what is your suggestions? What would be the right strategy for the Ukraine to take into account, to estimate such equation, take into account this feature?
Okay, that's a very good point. I think that is a big difference between, India is it's a huge country with 1 billion people and quite a closed economy, so it's fairly, as in the United States and a handful of countries, you can ignore the exchange rate in modeling inflation and not go too far astray. Whereas I guess I was a little surprised to learn the import to GDP is 60% or 50%. Yeah. So that clearly the exchange rate is going to be important. So actually that's a great research question, how to account for that. So one possibility is that we actually need another term in the Phillips curve capturing exchange rate depreciation. And of course, some people who estimate Phillips curves for open economies will put in an exchange rate depreciation term as an independent thing affecting inflation. Actually, one hypothesis, actually I've tried to encourage several PhD students to work on this, but they haven't done it. So maybe somebody here. Possibly, again, if you use median inflation, that may filter out some of the effects of the exchange rate. Because I think one way to think of a, how much did the exchange rate fall in 2014-15 by? Three. Yeah. So one way to think of that is like a huge supply shock. I mean, when in the U.S. in the 1970s, the prices that Americans paid for oil went up by 300%. And it wasn't because of a change in the exchange rate. It was because because OPEC tripled the dollar price of oil. Here, I presume that the prices of some imported goods in Ukraine jumped up by large amounts, and in that case, the reason was the exchange rate. But actually, I'm truly open-minded about this. I'm not sure, but I think it's possible that if you have prices of certain industries jumping around, it doesn't really matter why they jump around. Whether it's because of what OPEC did, or because of a poor harvest, or because of a change in exchange rates, which causes a jump in import prices. So I think it's possible that you could, if you look at median inflation in Ukraine, that would be much less, and perhaps you've looked at this. I might guess that median inflation would be quite a bit less sensitive to exchange rate changes than headline inflation is. And that if you look at median inflation, you might be able to get away with, in effect, a closed economy Phillips curve, which does not explicitly look at the exchange rate. But I'm not sure about that. Yeah.
Because even for this weighted median inflation, yes. So at the end we will see jump in this core inflation measure in 2014, 2015. And at the same time, we know that at that time the output gap was negative output gap was widening. So still we will have the link, the coefficient with the wrong side, and which will not correspond with our intuition what happened. So.
I mean, another possible answer, again, one way that Ukraine has been different from India or the U.S. in the 1970s is the inflation rate actually got up, to 40% or above 40%. And it could be that that's a high enough level that these relationships change somewhat. I think the kind of Phillips curve we apply here, I think, is designed maybe for countries with inflation rates of, say, 15% or below. So possibly going forward, if inflation, let's say, stays below 15% in Ukraine, maybe this kind of equation would fit relatively well, but that it wouldn't fit the huge shock in 2014-15, perhaps. Also, certainly, the slope of the Phillips curve and the output and inflation trade-off is different when you have very high inflation rates like that. So, yeah, I think any kind of simple, stable Phillips curve like the one I wrote down would not fit very well, when you had a really extreme period like 2014-15. I'm sorry, And actually, this happened yesterday. People would ask 2 questions at a time. I can't. So ask one question, and I'll try to answer, and then you can answer the second. What's that? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
What is place and role inflation and inflationary process in this cyclicality of economic development? Cyclicality of economic development is economic direction, important economic direction, because economy development in the cyclicality.
Oh, okay, so I think you're basically asking how important is inflation in economic development, or how important is reducing inflation for economic development? Is that the...
I don't understand.
What do you mean by cyclicality?
Циклічність економічного розвитку.
Розвитку, циклічність розвитку?
Да, циклічність економічного розвитку. Яка роль інфляції інфляційних процесів в циклічності економічного розвитку?
What is the role of inflation in driving the business cycle?
Okay, what is the role of inflation in driving the business cycle? I think my answer would be that I tend to, the causality goes in the other direction. So again, this equation here it has the output gap on the right-hand side and the inflation rate on the left-hand side. So I think, again, I think mainstream undergraduate textbooks would say that the business cycle is driven by shifts in demand, fiscal policy, monetary policy, shocks to the financial system, shocks to confidence, whatever affects demand. There isn't any, there's a debate about what effects inflation has on the efficiency of the economy and long-run growth, but I think the mainstream macro theory would say that in the short run, inflation is not what's driving economic booms and recessions. That's shifts in aggregate demand. But then booms and recessions or movements in output feed into inflation rather than the other way around. Does that address the question?
Mr. Bolll, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I would like to ask, perhaps you have some sort of insight on how you can forecast the producer price inflation, because in Ukraine the recent trend is that producer price growth is much faster than consumer prices. Maybe there are some sort of fundamental factors that are different from consumer inflation. Thank you.
Okay.
I also add to this question, some historical background, and actually that's very interesting to compare the situation here in Ukraine with the Indian situation, because frankly speaking, in Ukraine, producer inflation is mainly determined by the prices of commodities on external markets. So main part of our producer price, mainly our producer price index depends on the steel prices, iron ore prices, and on energy component prices. And because of this rebound of these commodities during the last 12, 18 months, so during this period, that was the reason why our producer inflation jumped to 40% at the time when our consumer inflation is just 12%. And from the central bank point of view, it's not so important for us, because when this high producer inflation reflects actually favorable conditions for the Ukrainian economy, and it creates appreciation pressure on exchange rate, and it leads even to low. I would say that there is no strong pass-through from producer prices to consumer prices in such situation when you have the exchange rate, volatile exchange rate, yeah. So flexible exchange rate. But your research on India, so it was mainly was directed to the producer prices, and in that case, it's that also interesting question why producer prices in India do not depend heavily on commodity prices, on global commodity prices. So you consider India as a closed economy, yeah, without any external impact. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm very glad you answered the question about, because I didn't know the answer about why producer prices rose more quickly. And I should say, generally, I think the focus of most central banks is on consumer prices, and that's the right focus. And the reason we looked at wholesale prices in India was simply the availability of data, that we needed industry-level inflation rates, and that only existed for a long period for the wholesale price index. But I think, I think you're essentially right, that if the central bank can keep consumer price inflation at a desirable level, if other price indices are moving in different ways, that reflects some relative price changes or some differences in composition, and those are things that the central bank maybe doesn't need to worry about if consumer price inflation is stable.
Seems for me this divergence between producer and consumer inflation is the result of the growth in relative price of commodities compared with the consumer and the manufactured goods. That's all. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yes.
My question is related to monetary policy or central bank of India. Knowing what went about in the monetary policy, what kind of inflation target the central bank of India target? Core inflation, inflation, median, average?
Okay, I think, so the question is, what inflation rate is the central bank, is the Reserve Bank of India targeting? I'm actually not certain of the answer, but I believe the answer is headline CPI inflation. And I think I discussed this with some of you before. I think, and I'm sure people are familiar with this idea, from the point of view of communication to the public, there's a strong case for targeting headline inflation because, well, probably the public doesn't completely understand what headline inflation is, but they understand that better than core inflation. And I think people also, I know in some countries there's been criticism of the central bank. The central bank has said things like headline inflation has gone up, but that's all right because core inflation is still low. And people get unhappy with the central bank because headline inflation has gone up because, say, food prices have gone up. And people say, you shouldn't tell us not to worry about it because we have to pay for food, that's still inflation. So I think in communicating with the public, you need to talk about controlling headline inflation in the medium run and maybe explaining that headline inflation can fluctuate somewhat because of changes in certain industries. But I think I think what a lot of central banks do, I think including the Federal Reserve, is internally they look a lot at core inflation. And even if their ultimate goal is to control headline inflation, that they believe that controlling core inflation is the best way to control headline inflation. So they focus on core in their internal discussions. But in their external communications, they focus on headline. And so I believe that, again, for communications reason, the inflation target in India is, and again, I forget the tolerance. I think it might be plus or minus 2 points. So a range from 2% to 6% for headline inflation is what they're targeting. I'm sorry, repeat that, please. And I can't, if you speak a little louder. Yeah. So if I understand, so the finding in our table is that food and energy are often the industries in the tails of the distribution, causing headline inflation to deviate from core inflation. In a sense, that doesn't, again, I think that an advantage of looking at the median is the central bank doesn't really have to keep track of which industries are where in the distribution. In a sense, if policymakers are told that some industry has had a huge price increase and that skewed the distribution and raised headline inflation, and the policymaker is trying to figure out what's the appropriate response, I would, arguably, it doesn't really matter what industry, you know, whether it's food prices going up because of a poor harvest, or whether, again, to use the US example, it's cigarette prices going up because of an increase in the tobacco tax, or whether it's women clothing prices going up because it's a new clothing season. That I think, again, from a monetary policy point of view, I think it doesn't, the distribution of price changes matters, but it doesn't really matter which industry is where in the distribution.
Yeah, I have a comment. You showed us a general approach when you analyze the relationship between the output gap and the inflation. But I want just to stress attention when we're trying to decompose GDP, for example, by the sectors. So if each of the sectors are performing better than potential, it pushes inflation up, except one, the agriculture. You know that if the agriculture is performing quite fast, for example, you have big harvest, it have different direction. So it pushes inflation down. So we introduced this feature in our model. So we're just trying to take out the effects of agriculture when we analyzing the relationships between the output gap and the inflation. And I think that maybe for, I don't know exactly the data for the India, but maybe taking into account that it's a poor country and the huge population, so this sector, agricultural sector, is maybe quite substantial in the GDP of India. Mm-hmm. So this feature could be used maybe to improve this.
Okay. Yeah. That's a very interesting idea I hadn't thought about. Yeah, in theory, the variable in the Phillips curve is the output gap, or output minus potential output. So if you could measure everything perfectly, yeah, if agricultural output went up because of good weather and a good harvest, that would be an increase in potential output. It wouldn't actually raise the output gap. Now, in practice, we do this very crude detrending with the Hodrick-Prescott filter. So I think, I hadn't heard about that. So you're suggesting just leaving agriculture out of GDP as
take it out, reverse the sign, and put it back. Maybe.
Oh, okay. No, that's a very interesting. That's a very interesting idea. I think my thinking about this is. it reflects spending a lot of time in the United States, where agriculture is not that big a part of the economy, and where output in agriculture is relatively stable, so that if you see output fluctuating, it's probably not changes in the agricultural sector in the U.S., but I can certainly see how that would be different in emerging economies. Actually, one other thing I'll mention, which might be relevant here, we use quarterly data on output as our measure of slack in the economy. One thing I think I want to explore in future research is using other measures of economic slack, because the output gaps that we find in India are suspiciously small. If you take it literally, if you take output in the U.S. and output in India, with quarterly data and detrend them, the fluctuations around trend look quite a bit smaller in India than in the United States, which taken literally would say that the business cycle is much smaller in India, where the economy is more stable. And that's somewhat counterintuitive. I think what might be going on at a very practical level is that the quarterly output data in India is not very good, and that a lot of it is done by interpolation, that there's annual output data, and in constructing quarterly data, people interpolate from the annual data, so that the measured quarterly output data is smoother than actual quarterly output. I don't know whether that's an issue people have thought about here, about whether people in India suggested using industrial production, in measures of industrial production in India are quite a bit more volatile than measures of GDP, and that maybe industrial production is measured more accurately at the quarterly level, and that's so one thing I've been meaning to do since we finished this paper is to redo the Phillips curve using industrial production rather than quarterly output. I don't know whether that's an issue here.
One moment, when you're making your Hodrick-Prescott detrending, you're using the parameter for the quarterly data 1600. But this parameter is estimated for the US data. Maybe it's not very appropriate for the India data. Maybe the business cycles are much shorter or longer in this country.
So do you think the parameter should be larger or smaller?
Maybe larger.
Like
I don't know yet, but it's definitely this parameter was estimated for the US data.
Yeah. Actually, well, the history of thought is actually nobody ever estimated it. Hodrick and Prescott just declared that 1600 is the right number, and they liked the results that produced. But you're right; it was based on U.S. data. Trying to think, I think we experimented a little bit with. Actually, let me look up. I think we experimented with 1600 and 16,000. And again, that's based on my experience mainly with U.S. data, that sometimes 1600 doesn't smooth enough, and 16,000 does a better job. I know there's a footnote in our paper. There have been some people who have argued that for emerging markets, and again, I forget exactly the argument and why something's larger or smaller, but people have argued that you should use a smaller smoothing parameter for emerging economies. But if you use a smaller smoothing parameter, then that means that output gaps get even smaller. So with a parameter of 1600, yeah, I'm frankly, I'm not very satisfied with how we measure, how we measure slack in the Phillips curve, because I'm skeptical of the quarterly output data we use, and the Hodrick-Prescott filter is a somewhat crude, arbitrary way of detrending. So there might be room for improvement on measuring the output gap or measuring economic slack.
And thanks a lot for your presentation. It is very interesting. And could you tell us what is your opinion? How long should be central bank inflation target? Because under our inflation targeting, we should forward guidance our policy, and we should provide some forecast of inflation. But as you mentioned, there is no clear evidence whether 5% or 2% is better. And for how long should we provide our target, for example, for 3 years or for 5 years? Because maybe in some future we will like to change it, to reduce or to increase.
So I'm not, I think maybe you're asking 2 or 3 questions. So,
No,
so I guess there's a question. I think the conventional thinking in inflation targeting is you want to eventually get to a steady state with a constant inflation target. So one question is, what's the right steady state inflation target to aim for? And 5%, which I take it as the number here, seems like a reasonable thing to aim for eventually, certainly. And we discussed this in my talk yesterday. I mean, Poland has a 2% target, is that right? I mean, that 2.5, yeah. So I'm not, I mean, everybody's been so hospitable here. I won't criticize anything about policy in Ukraine, but I can criticize policy in Poland. I think a target of 2.5% seems too low. Even for the United States, 2 or 2.5% is too low because of the zero bound problem. And I think in an emerging economy with larger, potentially larger shocks to the economy, that 2% is too low. 5% seems more reasonable. Now, now there's the question, given that inflation is starting above 5%, there's a question of how quickly to converge to 5%. And that I think, that is a hard question. I actually did a paper 20 years ago about what's the optimal speed of disinflation. Because again, going back to the United States in the 1970s, there were some people who said, well, we have to get rid of inflation, but we should do it very, very slowly so that there isn't much effect on the real economy. What the Fed finally did was actually reduce inflation quite quickly by raising interest rates by a very large amount and causing a very deep but fairly short recession and getting inflation down. So I guess that I don't know whether people use the same jargon. People talk about gradualism and disinflation or cold turkey and disinflation. Is the did you use the phrase cold turkey? That's no. Okay, so that's I guess an American phrase, and it originally applies to how to deal with alcoholism or drug addiction, or going cold turkey. Actually, I don't know why it's turkey. Going cold turkey means stopping immediately, even if it's painful. So, today I'm gonna stop drinking forever. As opposed to I'm gonna go from 6 drinks a day to 5 drinks a day to 4 drinks a day and slowly reduce it. So, so I think if we think about high inflation, like alcoholism as being an undesirable state, and we want to get rid of it, there's a debate about should it be done gradually so it's not too painful, or should it be done all at once? Now, again, I did a paper 20 years ago where I computed sacrifice ratios for different disinflation episodes in different countries. I think it was all advanced economies, but as I recall, about 60 different disinflation episodes. And one statistical result that came out pretty clearly was that sacrifice ratios were lower when inflation was reduced quickly. So the cold turkey approach was less, that again, and I think that this was borne out by the Volcker disinflation in the U.S. in the 1980s. Even though there was a sharp contraction, it was quite short-lived, so that arguably the total output losses were less than if the process had been dragged out slowly. So now, having said that, I'm not quite sure whether taken literally, those results would mean that if a country wants to reduce inflation from 12% to 5%, they should do it as quickly as possible. And I'm not sure I really believe that, or certainly don't believe that strongly enough to advocate it. But so I think it's still the question of how quickly to reduce inflation towards a long-run target is an open question. Yes. Now, and this is sort of an unfair question, but how was that path picked?
How did we get this part?
Yeah. I mean, or why wasn't it a quicker process or a slower process?
So, reminding the story, first of all, we tried to understand what is the best level of the optimal level of inflation for Ukraine in the medium term. Yeah, so we choose between 4 and 5. At the end, we decided that the economy will be too volatile in the medium term future, and 5% it's better caution from external shocks, from domestic shocks, and it's still so in the range which other emerging markets, central banks in other emerging markets have. So we stopped at 5%. After that, in the middle of 2015, when inflation was more than 50%, so annual inflation, we estimated how fast this disinflation could happen, and we also took into account the plan for the hikes in administratively regulated prices. Yeah, because from the beginning we decided that the core inflation should fall very fast, but because of this relative changes, relative prices changed. Yes, so 12% it was like 50% our forecast, 50% our target. Yeah, but of course, when we announced it as the target, we tried to manage our tools, monetary instruments to get into this point. And after that, we also had the path for administratively regulated prices, yeah, and we just considered how to decrease the core inflation plus this additional input to get smoothly to 5%. Again, at that point, the economy was in very bad shape. So we expected the output to fall by approximately 9–10% in 2015. So it was we estimated the negative output get to be very significant. So we decided that we can't allow ourselves to do very fast disinflation process. From our point of view, decrease of inflation from 50 to 12% was not actually so ambitious, because we know that we would, with the right policy, with the right monetary policy, with the support from fiscal policy, we could decrease the inflation quite fast. Yeah, but it's from my point of view, currently it's much harder to decrease inflation from 12 to 8 and 6 than it was done in the previous year, when we did it from 43% at the end of 2015 to 12% at the end of 2016. So we tried again. So it was like it was some trade-off between the disinflation, fast disinflation path we would like to see, but at the same time we took into account the disinflation cost for the output. Very sophisticated estimation.
Yeah, no, it was, yeah.
Just intuition. If we don't have any more questions to Professor Bolll, let's thank you for very interesting presentation. Yeah, I hope that this presentation and this research will encourage all of you to do something similar for Ukraine. Actually, I already got some ideas how to implement the similar things in the Ukrainian case. So I think it would be interesting to show you results at some point. Thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you.